downstream, and what's the specific interest of that country. Next slide. What we did in the book, or what our starting point was, we wanted to know, as there's an increasing discourse about water diplomacy and an increasing push by academics, by the media, but also by donor organizations for basin organizations to engage in water diplomacy, what can they actually do? Are they and can they be players in water diplomacy? And which factors drive, or which factors determine whether they can do so in the first place and whether they would be effective in doing so. And for that, we identified 4 different factors: the legal mandates of an RBO, the institutional structure that it is based on, but also the technical and the strategic resources that they have. And the combination of these factors determines, as the different case studies in the book show, what an RBO is actually able to achieve. So very often we see that basin organizations have been criticized, have been called toothless tigers for not being able to engage in water diplomacy. But very often this is due to factors that relate to, for example, the legal mandate or the institutional structure, that the RBO itself can't really change. It's up to the member states, or maybe also to donors, to help build capacity to set up the structures that would ultimately enable effective water diplomacy. So let's have a look at the different factors or different elements in a little more detail. Next slide. Let's look at the legal and the institutional setup first. So the starting point is, as you all know, the establishment of a basin organization on the basis of a legally binding agreement. Not necessarily in all cases, thinking about the Nile Basin here, and we have colleagues from the NBI here in the call with us today, but in many cases it's a legally binding agreement or a set of those that sets up the RBO in the first place. And why is that important? Because it manifests member states' commitment to cooperation, but also defines the principles and norms and rules based on which the RBO can operate. And therewith also ultimately determines the legitimacy of the RBO, which is a key factor for it being active in disputes, for example. Secondly, it is important what type of institutional setup the organization has. And by that, we mean both the organizational structure. So are there regular meetings at the higher policy level, but also regular meetings between technical experts? Is there a secretariat that can provide certain services, such as organizing meetings? But we also mean with that mechanisms, for example, to coordinate with stakeholders, to bring in national agencies, to engage in information and data sharing, which, as you can see in the right column, provides the fora for exchange, for discussion, and for joint decision-making. So you can imagine that if that is not present, it will be much more difficult for the RBO to fulfill any water diplomacy role. Next slide. So in addition to this, the setup, the structure, so the basis that water diplomacy could build on, we also looked at the technical and the strategic resources that RBOs have, keeping in mind that technical and strategic often overlaps and definitely goes hand in hand. So by technical, we mean activities that would typically fall under what I earlier referred to, transboundary water resources management. So not water diplomacy in the core sense, but things like data sharing, joint monitoring, flood forecasting, modeling, which, as I said, is in itself not a water diplomacy activity, but provides the basis for actually understanding the shared watercourse and developing responses to the challenges the watercourse is facing. Might it be drought, overfishing, pollution, or whatever else. So this has to be there for the RBO to be able to talk, to bring information, and to mediate between states about a certain problem that could potentially turn into a dispute and therefore needs water diplomacy action. And last but not least, we also looked at the strategic dimension. By strategic dimension, we mean the ability of the RBO to develop basin-wide plans, strategies, basin development plans, joint investment plans. So everything that contributes to a joint vision, a joint idea of where the riparian states want to head into the future in their basin, and which benefits of cooperation they want to develop and ultimately also to share in the basin, which ultimately is a prerequisite for preferably preventing, but in many cases at least mitigating or resolving conflicts. Next slide. What we did then, and what the book focuses on, and what the different chapters also in different ways build on, is a combination of these factors where we try, and Anoulak will talk you through that in a bit more detail when he talks about the key findings, where we try to place RBOs in different corners of this diagram. So some might have, and what you see in the red square, a low level of development of legal and institutional mechanisms. So they might not have an underlying agreement, or they might have a coordination mechanisms, but not a secretariat, or they might not have joint data sharing mechanisms yet, or not a defined dispute resolution, which makes their capacity to engage in water diplomacy very limited. But of course, as a consequence of that, also makes the outcomes that it can actually achieve in water diplomacy rather limited. The opposite dimension would be what you see in the green square, is a highly developed legal and institutional framework and a high technical and strategic capacity, which is the very ideal case of how RBOs could act in water diplomacy and could potentially also achieve the desired outcomes, which would be the prevention or the mitigation of disputes for the sake of the water resources and the people that depend on it, but also for the sake of regional stability and peace. And then many RBOs find themselves in the blue or in the yellow square, so somewhere in between. And with that, I would like to hand over to Anoulak, who will share some of the outcomes with you that the different chapters in the book present, before we let some of the chapter authors actually discuss these. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. So I have the tough job of placing where the different RBOs are. And this is, you can take it as work in progress. It's not prescriptive or judgmental. It is meant to give us an analytical framework to think about where we are, right? So if you're in the the quadrant that Susanna described in the top right-hand corner, where you have a high level of legal mandate, high or medium level of institutional development, and plus your technical capacity is strong, your strategic guidance are being used by the basin, then we think that the RBO's capacity to engage in water diplomacy is very functional. And the chances are that the RBO would have a good time or all the right framework to deal with conflicts and tensions. So we put some examples here, and the case study will talk more in the panel. For example, in the Colombia between US and Canada, Aaron said there's no RBO per se, but there's a series of institutional framework that exists there, including a very good benefit sharing mechanism. And when there's disputes, they can be able to manage that. To all the way to our own region with the Mekong. We have the 95 agreement, for example, which is a very legal and legitimate legal framework. We have the procedures that allow countries to know and deal with each other in terms of development, in terms of water use, in terms of dealing with impacts. We have our technical guidance in terms of all the monitoring that we do, all the data that we produce, all the studies that we've done, etc., which help with when countries have disputes to look at the data, to look at the science, and not just to talk from your heads or from your opinions. All the way to the Danube and the Rhine. You might think that these are European basins, they don't have conflicts. They do, right? But they do have an institutional framework to deal with that. And I think Ivan will talk about this a little bit better. So in these basins, we found that the legal framework is very well developed. It's very clear. The institutions are strong. There's working groups that exist. And there's basin plans that are being referred to. The capacity in terms of using data is there. And we found that most of the tensions and conflicts are being managed. They may not be resolved right away, right? But they're being managed and they don't spiral out of control. And there's sufficient level of trust between the riparian countries to work together, to come together, to discuss, right? So that's what we found in these high sort of basin. Next. So on the opposite end, and this is probably an extreme case, we don't find many, but in cases where there's no RBOs at all, right, such as Jordan, and Professor Tamir Samuel will talk more about this. It's very difficult for the countries to come together in terms of a legitimate basin-wide forum. So there's institutions that exist between bilateral countries, right? Between Israel and Jordan, between Palestine and Israel, etc. But there's no common RBO where everybody can get together. The rules of water use are not very clear. There's some technical work that are being done, but it's not probably being used at a high level, etc. So we found in these kind of basin, the tensions are quite high, and there's the channels or mechanism for states to come together and discuss these tensions do not often exist. So that's that. And then next, we move to sort of the where the legal mandates are quite clear. You know, there's agreement exists. The institutions are set up, but there's very little or non-technical or strategic work, or very low level at least. Or beginning to be developed, right? So in these kind of basin, we found that actually the capacity of the RBO are developmental, right? And the outcomes are emerging, meaning they're sort of on the right track, but they need to be pushed and they need to be supported by the riparian countries and by their partners in terms of institutional capacity to be able to absorb and take all of those technical and strategic work to make it work and to make it helpful for water diplomacy discussions. And then on the opposite flip side of that, where you have the next one, Daniel, where you have, and I think Professor Aaron already alluded to earlier about the Nile, for example, where you know, there is not a totally widely accepted RBO yet, and the legal framework is still being questioned somewhat. But there's a lot of technical and strategic work being done. You know, there's shared vision planning done by NBI. There's a number of monitoring that are being done, but these do not go beyond that, right? So they're not being optimally used to aid water diplomacy discussion. The same thing is in the Aral Basin. You know, during the Soviet times, there was a very strong benefit sharing mechanism, and then in the post-Cold War period, it sort of broke down into different institutional frameworks, very highly developed, but still there's a lot of challenges there. So that's the key findings of the book. Again, I said that you know, this is not prescriptive. It's meant for us to analyze and to learn from each other, which we will do in the panel. And it's not absolute scores, right? So nobody is perfect, and you're on a scale, right? So high could be high, medium, low could be medium, low. And I think we ultimately want to capitalize on the strengths. We want to reduce our weaknesses. We want to fill gaps. Right, so that's what we want to do in this book. Thank you. Back to you, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you, Anoulak, and thank you, Susanne, for the excellent presentation. And I really like your analytical framework, and I can find many of the river basin organizations I've worked with in this structure. And I also like to discuss later on maybe what does this structure, what do the different categories mean for development cooperation, for the specific support that river basin organizations might need from external partners. I've heard that there have been some sound problems on Facebook Live. I think they are solved by now, but I'm sorry for these sound problems. As we have started a bit later, I propose that we skip this round of question and answers, as there no pressing question and answers. No pressing questions at this stage, and I propose that we take the questions then during the panel discussion. Which then already leads me to the next part of today's event. And it's a pleasure for me to introduce today's panelists. First of all, Ivan Zawadzki is with us today from the Commission for the Protection of the Danube River. Ivan is the executive secretary of this commission, and he has negotiated, on the one hand, the text of the Danube River Protection Convention, helped to set up the ICPDR 25 years ago, and is now serving also in the implementation committee of the UNECE Water Convention. Ivan, good to see you, and great to have you on the call today.
Good morning, everybody. I'm also pleased to be with you.
Then we have Dr. Samir Talosi with us, and he's currently an associate professor at Jordan University of Science and Technology, where he teaches courses in water resource management, GIS, and hydroinformatics. His research expertise spans over varying scales, ranging from the plant root zone level to the farm level and to the watershed and regional level. Samir Talosi earned his bachelor degree in irrigation engineering from the Jordan University of Science and Technology in 1995, and his master and PhD degree in water resource engineering with a minor in geographic information systems from the University of California. His research expertise spans over varying scales, as mentioned before, from the farm level to the regional level. Greetings to Jordan, and welcome, Samir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Then we also have a GSZ colleague in the panel. Dr. Malte Grossmann is head of the GSZ Transboundary Water Cooperation programs in the Nile Basin. And before joining GSZ, he worked as a researcher at the Technical University in Berlin. And he holds a PhD from TU Berlin and a master's degree from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS in London, and from the University of Kiel. So Malte, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you very much for welcoming me.
And finally, we have Mohsen Nagebi. He's currently a doctoral candidate at Northumbria University School of Law, and he has over 10 years of experience as a senior practitioner in the field of transboundary water management and diplomacy, being involved in several projects and policymaking processes. Prior to joining Northumbria University, he has worked as a senior expert at the Ministry of Energy in Tehran, primarily collaborating on supporting and strengthening transboundary water cooperation. He holds a Master of Science in Water Conflict Management from UNESCO IHE in Delft. Thanks for joining this panel, Mohsen, and I'm happy to learn more today about the Helmand Basin.
Thank you very much. Please having me here. Thank you.
Excellent. So, and I would like to remind the audience, you can ask questions either in the chat box on MS Teams or on Facebook, and we'll take this the questions after a first round of opening questions. And I'd like to ask the first question to Malte and Ivan. Maybe you can describe a specific dispute or conflict situation in the Danube or the Nile Basin, and focus on the role of basin organizations and the role they have played in it.
Okay, Daniel, you mentioned me first, so I will take liberty to start. And I will just point the finger to the example also used in the book. So in principle, it was now 17 years ago that two contracting parties of our convention get into disagreement on the new project on making one of the channel in the delta leading to the recipient water body navigable also for Ukraine, to expand the navigability in that part. In particular, this is a transboundary territory. So another contracting party, Romania, raised the concerns about the environmental impact on this issue. So in principle, this was at the beginning, the first statement of Ukraine was there's no environmental impact. We have right to do on our territory what we want. We are deepening the channel to get our ship to Ismail, not through the channel in Romania. However, this issue was based to ICPDR at the first moment in a very heated way, I would say. But in principle then, when we ICPDR start to dig in deeper, what is the problem? Is there a problem with the environmental impact? Are the contracting parties to the ESPO convention? There is a UNEC convention on transboundary impacts. And so on and on, the discussion on the issues at our let's say our ground went to that countries agree to submit this disagreement or dispute to this UNEC convention on transboundary impact. So in a long run, it was very good that ICPDR was the first testing bed for exchanging technical information. And in particular, what I would like to say that since our framework is rather weak in comparison. There is no enforcement, there is no penalty, there is no stripping of voting rights in our decision-making process. This was more open discussion where all the technical issues went out. So that's finally ICPDR channeled this dispute to an internationally recognized dispute resolution system, and then implementation committee of the ESPO convention dealt with this issue, and the countries are really cooperating well on assessing and exchanging information, whether or what type of environmental impact is, how to mitigate. So really, ICPDR streamlined this, let's say, potential hot dispute or disagreement into a very civilized and orderly, organized international legal negotiation and dispute resolution. Thank you.
So Malte, do you have experienced a similar case in the Nile, or a specific case on a different dimension?
I will not start with the good, but I will come back to the good. So the NBI, or in the Nile, the NBI I often describe as a strong organization with a weak mandate. So NBI doesn't have a legal mandate, and it doesn't have a mandate in dispute resolution or the like, but it does have a mandate to help countries to move toward a cooperative agenda and develop cooperative projects in areas that are potentially prone to conflict. And I would also just comment that maybe the NBI, the Nile Basin, yes, it is fragmented, but it can also be seen as a multi-level, multi-actor kind of setting where we do have different intensities of cooperation. And I would like to give two examples that show that we have achieved roles of RBOs in mitigating conflict, and we do have major gaps remaining. So the idea of the NBI was actually to help countries where they have potentially differing interests in water resources development to come together and develop cross-border institutions, to build the knowledge base, and to develop joint investment programs. And we do have a lot of these examples, for example, in the East African part of the Nile Basin, where we have the Lake Victoria Basin, where we have the East African community kind of setting, where NBI has succeeded, for example, on the Mara River, which is shared between Kenya and Tanzania, and which has a lot of also diverging interests to move towards such a cooperative agenda with a joint basin water allocation planning process ongoing, with a set of multi-purpose projects being developed, and with permanent joint technical committee being established between a subset, in this case 2 countries, to actually take care of the diplomatic issues involved in developing this basin. And this obviously was the blueprint idea for the whole Nile cooperation process at large, and the idea was to move along those same lines. And now you have everybody is aware of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance done and the problems that have evolved around it. And the question can be, what role does NBI as the RBO play in this? And the answer would be that it doesn't play a role in it, because this major development has now remained in an arena which is outside of the RBO, but that has not always been the case. So if you look at this Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, it was also, let me say, the notion of upstream development and trying to balance upstream development ambitions and the needs of downstream riparians to maintain the water security. That was obviously the impetus at the beginning of the negotiations to form the NBI and to come to a legal framework. And there were obviously discussions at the beginning in the first decade of NBI also about this set of big dams that are developed to be developed in the Ethiopian highlands. But the process obviously stalled because of fundamental differences, both in regards to the specific infrastructure that was to be developed, but also the legal framework and the institutional framework. So these two things are interconnected. It led to a big impasse of a long period, and let me say, the more theoretical discussion about what does equitable and reasonable use actually mean, again came to a forefront when the big dams were, or the big dam was now actually built. And this was done outside of the framework of the NBI, because countries also, or especially Ethiopia, felt that the mechanism couldn't deliver on its development ambitions. So what does this case of the GERD show? It shows again now that in the NBI we do lack a dispute resolution mechanism, and we do lack a platform, inclusive platform of all riparians to have that regular dialogue about their developmental needs between the upstream set of countries and the downstream country, which is Egypt. And I think this reinforces again the need for continue to work on these mechanisms for the Nile Basin, because it just shows that as we enter into concrete construction programs, we do not have the institutional dispute resolution mechanisms in place to actually handle this conflict. So my picture of the Nile Corporation is like dual. We do have a whole set of, in a kind of multi-actor, multi-layer setting in the Nile. We have a lot of things that are working, where countries are using RBOs or to solve the issues, and we do have big gaps in major developments that are rather fundamental to the region that need to be worked on.
Thank you, Malte, and thanks for the insights from the Nile Basin and the Nile Basin Initiative. I would like to move now to a basin which was on the lower left side of the analytical framework, which is the Jordan Basin. And I'd like to ask Samir, how did the fact that there's no regional institution that addresses transboundary water conflicts affects conflict and cooperation dynamics in your basin? Maybe you can provide a specific example on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, this wasn't flattering to see Jordan isolated in one slide alone, but this is the reality. This is what I have had to deal with over the past 17 years working in Jordan in research and academia. So this is, we did reflect the reality in the presentation today, but also in the book. So going back to your question about cooperation and conflict, and taking them each part alone, and as we indicate in our chapter, and I have to thank my co-writer Natasha, who's also joining this call. Cooperation in the Jordan Basin has, over the past 2 decades, since signing the peace agreement between Jordan and Israel, has turned or materialized into a form of coordination rather than cooperation. Coordination to gauge the water resources, measure quantities, direct the flow in desired unnatural directions for ag or for agriculture or domestic use. So we have seen an investment between Jordan and Israel, and I will come back to that later and why. We have seen investment in infrastructure, in dams, in pipe networks and pumping stations to control water resources in the Jordan River and also the Yarmouk River, and ensure that Jordan receives its share. Israel also receives its share according to the signed agreement. Now, it's worth mentioning that the river, although is an international river with 5 riparians, including not only Jordan and Israel, but also the Palestinians and Syria and Lebanon, the reality on the ground have turned control. For example, Israel annexation of Syrian land has resulted in its full control about the Syrian riparian area of the Jordan River. Israel also controls part of the territory in Lebanon, and also have plans or have announced plans to annex Palestinian parts of the West Bank bordering the river. So the river turned into basically an effective 2 riparians, Israel on one side and Jordan on the other side, and that kind of shaped the nature, the type, the scope of cooperation, which has been started to being materialized publicly, officially after 1994. So this kind of summarizes the type or the nature of cooperation in the Jordan River Basin. Now, looking at the conflict side, although there have been in the past some armed conflicts, like targeted, minor, specific between between Israel and Syria at some point, tensions between other riparians. Conflict has not escalated. However, in the Middle East, the small Middle East, which includes these countries that I've mentioned, it is very difficult to separate conflict due to land disputes from other sources. Everything is intermixed together. There have been wars between these riparians in the past, and the reasons for that is land disputes for the most part. But I believe that a very critical review and analysis of these wars might reveal that control of water resources has probably been something on the mindset of those entities fighting. Alas, regardless of that, we are in a situation now where there is no apparent conflict related to water, but there is great tension. So we live in an area that is highly tense, which threatens or might lead to conflict in the future unless people of this land, with the support of the international community, realize a different path. As it stands now, water is divided between the two riparians, Israel and Jordan, and the sufferers for the most part are the Palestinians and the ecosystem itself. Thank you.
Thank you for explaining the situation around the Jordan or in the Jordan Basin. I'd like to come now to a basin which is not often in the focus of international attention, the Helmand Basin. And I'd like to ask Mohsen, how have conflict and cooperation dynamics between the two countries, Iran and Afghanistan, shaped the development of the Basin Organization in the Helmand River Basin?
Thanks for the question, Daniel. Well, I'm not going in detail, as already presented by Susanna and Anoulak. There is established a treaty in the Helmand and Basin Organization, but very limited, though there is hope to improve it. And surprisingly, compared to Jordan Basin, for instance, though there are some aspects of legal framework, I think the exchange and coordination between riparian states, Iran and Afghanistan, are relatively less. So direct to your question, basically the Helmand has seen massive political swings in the region over time, but I'm afraid there is nothing very dynamic in the case by itself. So it more gives a sense of paralyzed condition. I think basically, despite the fact that conflict over the Helmand River has often hit the headlines in a very negative sense, relations between Afghanistan and Iran over water issues have been marked by the coexistence of controversy and, in general, more often in kind of a controlled and conservative process of very limited cooperation. So while some alarming reports like to label the Helmand as the threats to the state's relations, by looking at the long history of the relations, I think that such labels may not accurately reflect the complexity of the basin and perhaps show false assumptions. Of course, the river suffers a lot from even a basic level of cooperation, but I think a critical question is why there has not been a significant change after almost 150 years. Just to give a couple of contextualizing remarks, I think what makes the Helmand very different is its anarchic geopolitical context and long-time dramatic war in Afghanistan and the effects on water diplomacy. We have a basin where it has been a battlefield of outsiders, Anglo-Russian rivalry since 18th century, American-Russian Cold War, then American invasion, and recently the peace negotiation, and the messy circumstances created after almost 20 years of the US war that caused likely kind of an eroding stalemate. So within this context, then I, with my co-author, Professor Rio Clark, did try to reflect on the negative correlation between such anarchy in Afghanistan and the performance of the Helmand River Commission. Both Iran and Afghanistan are struggling a lot with the symptoms of anarchy. So one of the symptoms is that the anarchic nature pushes both states to struggle for survival and self-help instead of seeing each other as partners. There is also a fear of cheating instead of building trust, and fear of relative gains instead of thinking about a basket of shared benefits. And ultimately, anarchy causes uncertainties in relations and leads to a serious fear of future that cannot sustain a friendship relation. So basically, in this context, the River Basin Organization has had very limited role to improve the cooperation and mainly used by both sides just to control the disputes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohsen, for the explanations about the conflict around in the Helmand River Basin and also about the River Basin Organization there. I'd like to take now a first question from the audience. First one from MS Teams, later from Facebook. There's a question by Benjamin Pohl from Adelphi. He would be interested in how the two major dimensions in your analytical framework, Susanne, interact. And the question probably goes to you, but also to Malte and Mohsen. Why do some institutions get stuck with low influence despite a highly developed mandate and institutions? And on the other hand, why do some manage high influence despite lacking a developed mandate? Maybe Susanne and Anoulak, you can go first on this.
Yeah, I can maybe give a quick answer, and then if any of the panelists want to substantiate that with a specific example from your basin. Thanks, Ben, for the question. I think what we didn't really mention so far in today's presentation and in today's webinar is the role of exogenous factors. So RBOs, of course, don't act in a void. They're embedded in a specific basin context, as I was saying in the beginning of my presentation. And ultimately, the willingness or the interest of riparian states to cooperate and to address water-related challenges in a cooperative manner is what determines the setup of the RBO, but what also determines then the role that the RBO can play. So in some cases, there might have been times where the states that established the RBO, that set up the agreement and the institution with a secretariat and maybe very fancy governance mechanisms, were interested in cooperation and therefore went that far to establish the RBO. But times might have changed, the geopolitical context might have changed, the interest of a country might have changed. There are many examples, but think of the Mekong when the MRC was established. Hydropower in Laos was not as much on the agenda as it is today. So things might have changed, and therefore there might be a different spirit among riparian states to cooperate or not to cooperate. So that's what explains highly functional or let's say super equipped RBOs still not making a difference. And I think the same goes for the other way around. I mean, I think it's really important to applaud the NBI for all the work that it's being done in the Nile Basin in the past years without actually having a binding legal framework, and with struggling setting up a real basin organization, struggling with several states sort of opting in and out of the cooperation processes. And still, I think the way it has shaped developments in the Nile Basin, if we look a bit beyond the obvious suspects of disputes such as the GERD, I think that's really a great example for the second dimension you mentioned, Ben. I don't know, Malte, if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I was wondering, it really is about the fundamental interests of countries that can't also easily be glossed over by, let me say, fancy institutional arrangement or the like. So we do have fundamental different interests, and the challenge I think the RBOs face is, of course, they do take a water approach. And I mean, because they are somehow largely nature of, let's say, ministries of water and the water community. And the approach that NBI, although I think the one we are struggling with in the Nile, is again to say, how do we bring this into a broader agenda that looks, into cross-sectoral trade-offs, but also political trade-offs across sectors? That's where you need foreign policy. That's where you need heads of states, where you need to bring in that whole energy sectors, agricultural sectors, and so on to form a cooperative regional integration agenda. And that goes way beyond the, let me say, the more sectoral setup of RBOs. I mean, we do, often say, I think many of the RBOs do have this cross-sector approach and thinking, but in reality, way often it does end up rather water focused. So I think this idea was there at the beginning of the NBI, take a broader benefit sharing approach and look at power interconnections and topics like that. But it's something I think that remains on the agenda, and where I also see the issue of linkage to hydro diplomacy, with foreign affairs bringing in the broader perspective of countries' relations beyond the water sector, which is crucial for the GERD. For example, the GERD negotiation is not really about water management; it's about rather fundamental trade-offs and relations of the countries, and I think that's where the the construction side is for us to become better in linking to that, in linking the insights and knowledge and basin perspective to the foreign policy perspective countries take.
Okay, thank you, Malte and Susanne. I'd like to take now one question from Facebook. There have been a couple of questions on the new hydropolitical water diplomacy constellation in the Mekong River Basin with the appearance of the Lansang-Mekong Cooperation. And I'd like to ask now Anoulak and Dr. Hada, how does the Mekong River Commission see the cooperation with this new Lansang-Mekong Cooperation, and also maybe in the wider context of China and the US?
Thank you, Daniel. Dr. Lapas, the microphone to me. Thank you for the question. I think it's a very strategic question. How the MRC should position itself, in this context is very important. So I would like to stress that MRC should not be politicized. And because this organization was created in order to support their member country, its member country, and we need to base on the scientific information, data, study in order to support member country. And of course, each member country can have their political position toward, any superpower. But again, I repeat that this organization must not be politicized. And the affair of riparian country and it need to be addressed and dealt with by the member country. I think this is very important. And now let's talk about how I think MRC is going to cooperate with the two major powers. I think right now I'm very pleased. Now let me talk first with the LMC. I think so far we have a number of mechanisms in place. We have dialogue with China every year. We have the LMC, and through LMC, we have the MOU with the LMC Water Resource Center. And so far, we have identified a number of areas of cooperation. I think we have working on that. But unfortunately, because of COVID-19, last year we could not advance too much. But now we are working because we have identified a number of activity, joint activity already. And look at our US colleague. I think we also have the mechanism. I can share with you the cooperation between MRC and US Corps of Engineers. And we also have a number of MOU like with Arizona State University. And we believe that we can further work with US in order to enhance our capacity, especially the use of advanced technology in the area of satellite technology to complement or to provide it to support our data gap. I think this is something that we can work, and we also very pleased to see recently the launch of the Mekong Dam Monitor and also the LMC data information website. I think those kind of website provide an important sources for us to to refer to in order to enrich our study or as well as for our daily and monthly monitoring. So this is very important. So we will continue to work with all. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the elaborations. And I'd like to move now to the Danube Basin, and I'd like to ask Ivan, what have been success factors and bottlenecks in making the RBO a water diplomacy actor in your case, and what can be learned from the Danube for other basins?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think I would say the bottlenecks, not really bottlenecks, but the challenges in our system, speaking about the water diplomacy, are twofold. First of all, we have 15 contracting parties, 14 sovereign states, and the 15th is the European Union, which work in two different setups. 9 of these contracting parties are members of the European Union, so they are fully covered by EU legislation, which is very complex, which is very comprehensive and really holistic one. So actually there is not so much room for dispute, and the countries have to fit in this framework. 5 others are not members, but fortunately they are more or less associated with EU, so they are on their way either to be a members, like a candidate, or sign association treaties. So they want to align their legal framework with EU, but still they are different. So in that respect, and plus our dispute resolution mechanism, as is written in our convention, is quite rigid. Either we have this standard international practice, like set up an arbitration panel, or in the case arbitration wouldn't work, that the contracting parties has right to go to International Court of Justice, which nobody wants to go do it. And in principle, this is not a very successful sign of cooperation. However, I would say the success features are that ICPDR provide an excellent platform for open exchange at the technical level. So any technical problem with regard to water quantity, quality, planning, flood protection, public participation, everything is dealt with the specialized expert groups. So expert groups are comprising from the representative of the national institutions, which are in charge of the specific issue in the country. So whatever is being developed at the technical level is then submitted for a political approval at the commission level, and then when it comes to implementation, these are the same people who design it. So there is the policy arc of the work of the ICPDR is very perfectly tied, so there is not so much problem with that. Secondly, as we said, our framework for dispute or for conflict prevention is rather weak. We have article on obligation on providing information on upcoming projects which might have transboundary impact. However, countries are using this perspective, but there is no enforcement. There is no, let's say, penalization in our system. So, for example, we don't have a article which would say that after violation of certain article of our convention, countries will be stripped of voting right. So in principle, this rather soft and totally technical framework provides an excellent framework for exchange of the information, which countries might not be willing to do when it is more formal at the level of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, international lawyers, anything like that. So really the technical cooperation is base, which smoothens the way forward, reaching also then agreement on more sensitive, politically influenced issues. So I would say that water diplomacy very much depends, the quality or the result of water diplomacy depends on the quality and openness and trustworthiness at the technical level. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. And I'd like to ask Susanne now, can we continue for another 5 minutes, if this is okay for you? Because I still want to take one more question from the audience, and I'd like to merge them with a question that I have. My colleague Christine was asking, what can be done in a low-low type scenario, and what would be the best way intervention strategy for development cooperation? And I'm interested to link that also and give that question to Samir first, and after your reflections on the current situation in the Jordan Valley, in the Jordan Basin, do you think there's room for establishing a basin organization in the future?
Thank you. Yeah, this is what professionals in the Middle East and the academia have been contemplating for the most part. What can we do to get out of this this tight situation that we are in. And as we have indicated in the chapter, there have been attempts. There have been attempts by civil organizations, NGOs, supported by major international donors. I mean, most international donors have contributed to improving the technical and institutional aspects governing and affecting the Jordan River Basin, but that did not translate into creating a multilateral organization, because it seems that the hindering factor always is the land disputes, particularly between Israel and Palestine. So I am an optimistic person in general, but when it comes to the Jordan River, it doesn't. It is highly unlikely that there will be any progress on an organization like this or any other multilateral format that brings all riparians together before resolving the territorial disputes, because in one way or another, water rights will mean at some later point land rights, and there is and that might not be accepted by riparians in the basin. The Jordan River, although I'm not really following the geographies of all the other rivers, the Jordan River in particular is also a borderline. So it does not cross countries. It actually flows on the borders of Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. So another dimension or another factor that is causing this low criteria for this river is the fact that it is a military zone. It's a borderline. So people do not have normal people, the citizens, even the Israelis, for the most parts of the lower Jordan River, do not have access to the river itself. So it is not visible. It's not used for fishing. It's not used for recreation. It is no longer a navigable river as it used to be 50 or more years ago. So it is out of sight. Therefore, very few and select NGOs are tackling issues of the river. Unfortunately, I mean, the short answer would be no, not in the current situation. It is almost impossible to have such an organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds very realistic, and I'd like to move before handing over to Susanne for some closing remarks. I have one question that probably goes partly to Mohsen and partly to Malte. Now we have heard about the situation in the Helmand Basin. Mohsen, what would be your recommendation to enhance the basin organization's functionality so that they can effectively deal with conflict in the basin? And then maybe to Malte, if you take such a situation like in the Helmand or from another quadrant from the Nile Basin, what role can development cooperation play to support river basin organizations in these two intermediate settings?
Well, thank you for the question, Daniel. One important point here, I think, is that the existing organization, which is based on the bilateral treaty, and they have also regular meeting every year, is very limited to only a fixed water allocation without providing any room for addressing the many other issues that have been the basis of the conflict now. For instance, at the time of flood, there is no formal line of communication to handle it, and and both sides are often deal with flood individually. Or for instance, there is also a lack of a basin-wide perspective to for instance, conserve ecosystem in particular Helmand wetlands at the delta of the Helmand. So the existing legal arrangement and such organization with very limited tasks by themselves remain an empty and false promise with regard to offering an effective remedy for both sides. So with this, as many of us in this meeting are pretty well aware, there might be a long list of suggestions, either in technical and managerial solutions or institutional revisions to improve the performance of the Basin Organization. However, I think as far as the nature of the dispute doesn't change, we cannot expect big improvement to render the situation equitable and sustainable. One key point, in my view, is creating a shared understanding between both sides in order to, at least at the first step, produce a relatively a stable pattern of behavior. With this, we may expect, certainly help to build trust between parties. Such shared understanding is crucial and could potentially balance all the interests of both sides, and more importantly, in my view, reflect the inequity and the harms that both sides are suffering from them, but now, leaving all of them untouched with many misunderstandings. By the way, creation of such a shared understanding unavoidably requires process of active participation and cooperation and a dialogue between parties. Unfortunately, in spite of many efforts, it seems still, there is unwillingness perhaps from Afghanistan to cooperate because of some reasons and insisted on unilateral developments. Sometimes we may see a situation that one state doesn't want a solution and likes to maintain the status quo and play with time or even play with diplomacy. So political willingness is really, really important. But I would like to say beyond all of these, we see again unbreakable cycle in which anarchy casts a dark shadow over everything in the basin and hampers the creation of such shared understandings. Of course, there are many internal factors too, but these external factor is significantly influence on the progress. And I think the solution for such context is mainly out of the water box, and one might be focusing on regional geo-economic cooperation. And there are recently some hopes to go through this way. But again, it's yet very soon to see the outcome. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mohsen. And Malte, is there anything to add from a development cooperation perspective? Your microphone is off, I think.
So yes. Now let me share maybe the perspective we have developed in the Nile as part of German cooperation of how development partners or international cooperation partners can engage. Obviously, Europe, or we have an interest in our neighboring regions and peace and security in our neighborhood, and it is a policy objective. And what we are saying is that obviously the countries need to bring to make use of the quite large diplomatic capital that has been kind of amassed to decades, often decades of cooperation, development cooperation, other kind of cooperation that has made countries, for example, like Germany, into rather reliable partners in many processes that don't just come in and go out, but are there for really quite a long period. And I think that's also one of the strengths of the BMZ or GIZ programs, that they have engaged for periods of up to 20 years in these processes. And what's often lacking is the linkage of this diplomatic capital with the let me say, the diplomatic weight of countries like Germany or European Union or the others in these kind of processes, because the linkage to the political engagement is often not there. So I think that's something that we've been trying to also develop in the Nile, to say that we want to have a partnership between development cooperation and foreign affairs. We have different sets of programs, and that all need to be thought in a coherent manner to actually bring the full potential of this cooperation into the weighing scale, and not make it into fragmented piecemeal approaches. And the development cooperation, I think, really brings that aspect of building institutions, of building up organizations like RBOs. It also brings in that massive investment that is often required, like through KfW or other investment funding mechanisms, to actually enable cooperation, by doing things on the ground, building things and the like, which is a very important factor. And then on the Foreign Office side, yes, I think we have developed more of these kind of approaches to look at a capacity building, training for hydro diplomacy, which is obviously done with a lot of stakeholders, the UNECE, international water law trainings and the like, but also to support topics like public diplomacy, that is media engagement in the public framing of water conflicts, and various track 2 formats that bring together practitioners or scientists and so on. I think many of the colleagues who are in this call are involved in this kind of engagement of bringing together scientists and so on to bring these ideas to the table. But then there's that missing part, which is, at least for GIZ, is variously or where we often have a missing link, which is actually a link to the foreign policy community. And we are here talking about tools like special envoys or dedicated special representatives who can bring the political leverage and the political weight of partners like the European Union also to the table, which is often important in helping that, bringing that, helping that convening and helping processes go forward, strengthening, for example, the African Union in the capacity as observers or facilitators and the like. So these would be, I think, what roughly is what we can do about helping strengthening RBOs capacity in water diplomacy, and we do have quite some varied set of experience, for example, within GIZ, where we've been doing that beyond the Nile.
Thank you, Matt, for highlighting this dimension and for linking the support of development cooperation to RBOs and water diplomacy to the broader political context, and for underlining that the need for a coherent approach between development cooperation and foreign policy. Well, we are already a bit over our time. I'd like to hand over to Susanne now for some closing remarks, and I would also like to invite the participants, the panelists, to go through the questions that have been raised in the chat and on Facebook. And if you can find time, it would be great if you could answer some of the questions later on. Yeah, Susanne, over to you.
Thank you, Daniel, and thanks to all the panelists. I won't try to summarize the discussion. It was way too rich and we're already beyond time. I would just like to highlight maybe two things that I think came out of today's discussion. I think, first of all, it is important to build the capacity of countries and of basin organizations to engage in transboundary water management and water cooperation, and specifically also in water diplomacy. But as was highlighted, this, of course, is not the silver bullet. It's not going to help by itself. It also always depends on the willingness and the interest of the riparian countries in a basin to cooperate and to engage in joint projects and joint basin management and so on. But to end on a positive note, I think what we see in many of the basins around the world is that countries have indeed acknowledged the benefits that cooperation can bring, the benefits that cooperation can bring over long time compared to short-term unilateral considerations. And I think what's important for us as experts, as practitioners, as academics, as representatives of the, development organizations, is to highlight these benefits of cooperation, to convince policymakers that they are there, but to also work together on actually sharing these benefits in a more equitable manner, so that all the countries in a basin, but also all the different parts of society, the different communities, the different sectors, actually get their fair share of the benefits, because that's what it ultimately needs to sustain cooperation over time, to move from a potentially momentary commitment of cooperation by signing a treaty to actual long-term management and long-term joint development of a river basin for the sake of everyone, not only the governments involved, but also the populations living in these basins. And I think we've gotten quite far in the last decades there. We just have to keep on the good work. Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, Susanne, and thanks, Anoulak, for the excellent book, which will help us to plan and to structure our interventions in the future. Thanks to all the panelists, to the 4 panelists, and thanks also to Aaron and Dr. Harder for setting the scene and for the opening remarks. Well. As Hanno Führen already mentioned, and probably some of you are already asking where can I find the book, Hanno has posted a link to the where the book can be purchased into the chat box, and I think we will, as I said, profit a lot from this book in the future. And by saying this, I'd like to close this meeting, and also would like to give the word to our colleagues at the MRC, and to also close the meeting on Facebook Live. Thank you very much from my side, and yeah, see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.